Or an absurdity, said Titania. We had to beat Germany, or where would civilization have been? We had to beat Germany, yes, but the absurdity lies in the fact that we had to beat ourselves in doing it. The first thing you'll find when the peace conference gets to work will be that we shall have to help Germany onto her feet again, so that she can be punished in an orderly way. We shall have to feed her and admit her to commerce, so that she can pay her indemnities. We shall have to police her cities to prevent revolution from burning her up. And the upshot of it all will be that men will have fought the most terrible war in history, and endured nameless horrors, for the privilege of nursing their enemy back to health. If that isn't an absurdity, what is? That's what happens when a great nation like Germany goes insane. Well, we're up against some terribly complicated problems. My only consolation is that I think the bookseller can play as useful a part as any man in rebuilding the world's sanity. When I was fretting over what I could do to help things along, I came across 2 lines in my favorite poet that encourages me. Good old George Herbert says, "A grain of glory mixed with humbleness cures both a fever and lethargicness." Certainly, running a second-hand bookshop is a pretty humble calling, but I've mixed a grain of glory with it, in my own imagination at any rate. You see, books contain the thoughts and dreams of men, their hopes and strivings, and all their immortal parts. It's in books that most of us learn how splendidly worthwhile life is. I never realized the greatness of the human spirit, the indomitable grandeur of man's mind, until I read Milton's Areopagitica. To read that great outburst of splendid anger ennobles the meanest of us simply because we belong to the same species of animal as Milton. Books are the immortality of the race, the father and mother of most that is worthwhile cherishing in our hearts. To spread good books about, to sow them on fertile minds, to propagate understanding and a carefulness of life and beauty, isn't that high enough mission for a man? The bookseller is the real Mr. Valiant for truth. Here is my war alcove, he went on. I've stacked up here most of the really good books the war has brought out. If humanity has sense enough to take these books to heart, it will never get itself into this mess again. Printer's ink has been running a race against gunpowder these many, many years. Ink is handicapped, in a way, because you can blow up a man with gunpowder in half a second, while it may take 20 years to blow him up with a book. But the gunpowder destroys itself along with its victim, while a book can keep on exploding for centuries. There's Hardy's Dynasts, for example. When you read that book, you can feel it blowing up your mind. It leaves you gasping, ill, nauseated. Oh, it's not pleasant to feel some really pure intellect filtered into one's brain. It hurts. There's enough TNT in that book to blast war from the face of the globe, but there's a slow fuse attached to it. It hasn't really exploded yet. Maybe it won't for another 50 years. In regard to the war, think what books have accomplished. What was the first thing all the governments started to do? Publish books. Blue books, yellow books, white books, red books. Everything but black books, which would have been appropriate in Berlin. They knew that guns and troops were helpless unless they could get the books on their side too. Books did as much as anything else to bring Americans into the war. Some German books helped to wipe the Kaiser off his throne. I Accuse, and Dr. Mühlen's magnificent outburst, The Vandal of Europe, and Lichnowsky's private memorandum that shook Germany to her foundations, simply because he told the truth. Here's that book, Men in War, written, I believe, by a Hungarian officer, with its noble dedication to friend and foe. Here are some of the French books, books in which the clear, passionate intellect of that race, with its savage irony, burns like a flame. Romain Rolland's Au-dessus de la Mêlée, written in exile in Switzerland, Barbuse's terrible Le Feu, Duhamel's bitter Civilization, Bourget's strangely fascinating novel The Meaning of Death, and the noble books that have come out of England, A Student in Arms, The Tree of Heaven, Why Men Fight by Bertrand Russell. I'm hoping he'll write one on why men are imprisoned. You know, he was locked up for his sentiments. And here's one of the most moving of all, The Letters of Arthur Heath, a gentle, sensitive young Oxford tutor who was killed on the Western Front. You ought to read that book. It shows the entire lack of hatred on the part of the English. Heath and his friends, the night before they enlisted, sat up singing the German music they had loved, as a kind of farewell to the old, friendly, joyous life. Yes, that's the kind of thing war does. Wipes out spirits like Arthur Heath. Please read it. Then you'll have to read Philip Gibbs, and Lowes Dickinson, and all the young poets. Of course you've read Wells already. Everybody has. How about the Americans? Said Titania. Haven't they written anything about the war that's worthwhile? "Here's one that I found a lot of meat in, streaked with philosophical gristle," said Roger, relighting his pipe. He pulled out a copy of Professor Latimer's Progress. "There was one passage that I remember marking. Let's see now, what was it? Yes, here. It is true that, if you make a poll of newspaper editors, you might find a great many who think that war is evil. But if you were to take a census among pastors of fashionable metropolitan churches, that's a bull's-eye hit. The church has done for itself with most thinking men. There's another good passage in Professor Latimer, where he points out the philosophical value of dishwashing. Some of Latimer's talk is so much in common with my ideas that I've been rather hoping he'd drop in here some day. I'd like to meet him. As for American poets, get wise to Edwin Robinson." There is no knowing how long the bookseller's monologue might have continued, but at this moment Helen appeared from the kitchen. "Good gracious, Roger!" she exclaimed. "I've heard your voice piping away for I don't know how long. What are you doing, giving the poor child a Chautauqua lecture? You must want to frighten her out of the book business." Roger looked a little sheepish. "My dear," he said, "I was only laying down a few of the principles underlying the art of bookselling." "It was very interesting. Honestly, it was," said Titania brightly. Mrs. Mifflin, in a blue-checked apron and with plump arms floury to the elbow, gave her a wink, or as near a wink as a woman ever achieves. Ask the man who owns one. "Whenever Mr. Mifflin feels very low in his mind about the business," she said, "he falls back on those highly idealized sentiments. He knows that next to being a parson, he's got into the worst line there is, and he tries bravely to conceal it from himself." "I think it's too bad to give me away before Miss Titania," said Roger, smiling. So Titania saw this was merely a family joke. "Really, truly," she protested, "I'm having a lovely time. I've been learning all about Professor Latimer, who wrote The Handle of Europe and all sorts of things. I've been afraid every minute that some customer would come in and interrupt us." "No fear of that," said Helen. "They're scarce in the early morning." She went back up to her kitchen. "Well, Miss Titania," resumed Roger, "you see what I am driving at. I want to give people an entirely new idea about bookshops. The grain of glory that I hope will cure both my fever and my lethargicness is my conception of the bookstore as a powerhouse, a radiating place for truth and beauty. I insist, books are not absolutely dead things. They are as lively as those fabulous dragon's teeth, and being sown up and down may chance to spring up armed men. How about Bernhardi? Some of my corncob friends tell me books are just merchandise. Pshaw!" "I haven't read much of Bernard Shaw," said Titania. "Did you ever notice how books track you down and hunt you out? They follow you like the hound in Francis Thompson's poem. They know their quarry. Look at that book, The Education of Henry Adams. Just watch the way it's hounding out thinking people this winter. And The Four Horsemen. You can see it racing in the veins of the reading people. It's one of the uncanniest things I know to watch a real book on its career. It follows you and drives you into a corner and makes you read it. There's a queer old book that's been chasing me for years. The Life and Opinions of John Buncle, Esquire, it's called. I've tried to escape it, but every now and then it sticks up its head somewhere. It'll get me some day, and I'll be compelled to read it. 10,000 a Year trailed me the same way until I surrendered. Words can't describe the cunning of some books. You'll think you've shaken them off your trail, and then one day some innocent-looking customer will pop in and begin to talk, and you'll know he's an unconscious agent of book destiny. There's an old sea captain who drops in here now and then. He's simply the novels of Captain Marryat put into flesh. He has me under a kind of spell. I know I shall have to read Peter Simple before I die, just because the old fellow loves it so. That's why I call this place the Haunted Bookshop. Haunted by the ghosts of the books I haven't read. Poor uneasy spirits. They walk and walk around me. There's only one way to lay the ghost of a book, and that is to read it." "I know what you mean," said Titania. "I haven't read much Bernard Shaw, but I feel I shall have to. He meets me at every turn, bullying me. And I know lots of people who are simply terrorized by H.G. Wells. Every time one of his books comes out, and that's pretty often, they're in a perfect panic until they've read it." Roger chuckled. "Some have even been stampeded into subscribing to the New Republic for that very purpose. But speaking of the Haunted Bookshop, what's your special interest in that Oliver Cromwell book?" "Oh, I'm glad you mentioned it," said Roger. "I must put it back in its place on the shelf." He ran back to the den to get it, and just then the bell clanged at the door. A customer came in, and the one-sided gossip was over for the time being. End of chapter 6.